Well, good morning, everybody. Our first animation today, like I normally show, is the satellite data from Sunday. And what we had was a pretty deep trough over the east after a system that took nearly a week to cross the country delivered some pretty heavy rainfall. It's currently spinning just off the coast early this morning here on Monday. But it was neat to see some of the both open and closed cell convection. This is very shallow convection that moved throughout parts of the Midwest, Mid-South, and East as this system rolled through. And you can actually see the cloud streets showing up down here in the Gulf, which indicates a lot of cold air that made it pretty far into the south. Now, this is going to be something we're going to see for the next 7 to 10 days. We're going to see more cooler weather to the east and a lot of warmer weather to the west, but there are some indications of a pretty sizable pattern flip. I want to talk to you about that. That should be here as we approach the end of October and what that might mean as we go forward. So we're going to kind of review some of the longer range stuff first. Okay, how much rainfall did we actually get? This is looking at the last 7 days of total accumulated precipitation across the country. And again, we had pretty well predicted. I was impressed overall with the models, picking up on the systems that came through the Northwest, slowly moved throughout parts of the Western Corn Belt here into the Great Lakes, and then again Satin kind of spinning here early this morning, just offshore, just off the map. We watched the pulse of tropical moisture from the Bay of Campeche roll through parts of the southeast, delivering much more rain than initially predicted through parts of Georgia and South Carolina, even parts of North Carolina. And overall, we did see a little band of storms that kind of rolled through parts of the South and the Mid-South, but the areas that have been missed included the Mississippi River here, much of the Southern Plains and the Canadian Prairie. Now, we're still waiting on the start of the wet season for California, but we've got to get a good, strong subtropical jet or a deep trough to come in from the Pacific Northwest to get rain into that area. And as we looked at recently, we know that most of California is completely out of drought. There's just a couple of areas that are abnormally dry. The reservoirs are above historical averages, meaning that they're going to go into their wet season in California with something that hasn't happened in a number of years with having such good reservoir levels. I want to show you one other thing here. Let's go here. Let's put I call it snow. There we go. This is the seasonal snowfall total so far, just to kind of keep you up to date. Kind of heavy snowfall so far has been here in parts of Yellowstone, just south of it as well. But last night it did snow in the Blue Ridge Mountains, so we had some snow here, pretty high elevation, but I just want to keep you up to speed on what this snowpack looks like. Now, with all of this rain that came across this area, we would expect this to be getting into the Mississippi River, but it's going to take time, and in addition to that, remember that the soils are very dry. So we just get our latest update on the Mississippi River. It's now the lowest number I've seen. 11.73 is where the river is at in Memphis. And so on Friday, if you didn't get a chance to watch it, we talked about the impact of the low Mississippi and the drought in Panama, remembering that if Panama does not get the normal rainfall it's expected for the rest of October into November, they start their dry season in December, meaning we'll be talking about drought in the Panama Canal all the way through next year, mid-year next year. But the combination of that with the Mississippi River levels being so low is really impacting, the Western Hemisphere shipping. So we just need to consider this as we continue to move forward. Now, again, did all of that rain soak in? Well, the latest modeled soil moisture data from NASA, while it shows above average values in through here, we can just see so much of this part of the Missouri Basin, the Mississippi and the Ohio, plus the Great Lakes, all the way down to the lower, what we commonly call the Delta, this whole region down here, just so incredibly low on soil moisture, which means we still need to see repeated systems like this coming through in order to improve the overall water situation. Speaking of that, I want to show you the latest, front half of the month of October precipitation ranks. So again, we're just trying to identify these areas that just continue to miss out on a lot of precipitation. So there's a lot here, Kansas, Missouri, pockets of Oklahoma. Then we keep an eye on like Tennessee, Kentucky, over here to North Carolina, Virginia. In order to see a lot of moisture begin to return to these areas, it would be helpful to get some ridging down here over Florida. So what that would do would be opening up the Gulf to more transport of moisture. As these systems roll across, they're just running out of it. And as the fronts dive through here, they're just not picking up, and lifting, moisture-laden air to produce a lot of precipitation. Meanwhile, because of last week's system, we're looking at this stretch from Wyoming through parts of Iowa that has now brought these ranks up, in the top 10. So very, very wet in those specific areas. Okay, as we look at where this is going, I'm going to show you some big things that are going to be changing. The front half of October featured two large ridges in the flow. One was in Canada here, and one was here over parts of Europe, Northern Africa. What we saw the jet stream do was dip to the south of it. It extended across the Pacific. it really just stayed south. A lot of colder air that moved into the east, for a while, especially the southeast. And we just continue to get this flow around the southern side of these, especially of this larger ridge. All right. Now that larger ridge was a bit interesting result of the overall pattern. I made a case that I say, right now I don't see the northern hemisphere. I'm talking about like the northern latitudes. Forgive me, like the concentration of snow, the snowpack in Siberia, or the sea ice in the Arctic, or the Bering Sea and the way it's developing. I didn't see any of these northerly latitude things really controlling the pattern outside of these high pressure cells. Okay, I still think a lot of this pattern through the rest of fall is going to be dictated by what goes on in the tropics. So I've tried to make a case that with the MJO so firmly in phase 8 or phase 1 and expected to stay there, that we should expect to see at times broader troughs developing over the west, some sense of ridging trying to move out of the Caribbean and Gulf into the southeast. And instead of having these ridges sitting right here over the middle part of Canada, possibly move them a bit farther to the east. See that? I mean, that would be what would typically happen with MJO phase 8 and El Nino in October. So the combination of those two things. Or what if it was phase 1? Because remember, phase 8 and phase 1 kind of share some of the same space. You still get that same sense, right? We tend to just see better evidence of troughs being in the forecast to come into the west, and it's some sort of ridging that runs up the east. And then, again, no big high latitude block over Canada. It tends to be a more open and flowing pattern overall. So what did the jet stream do? Well, the jet stream earlier in the month extended across the North Pacific. It was quite strong here. It dipped into a trough in the west. So can you see the arrows kind of dipping there? But it was met by pretty strong subtropical flow here, which meant this didn't bounce back up into a big ridge. We kept cooler air at times over the southeast with this particular pattern. Now, where I think this is going to go, it's going to look something like this. We watched for the front half of October a lot of subsidence right here in the Indian Ocean, which gave us rising motion here over MJO phase 7-8 and also over Africa, which we kind of call phase 1 right in this area. So again, air sinking here and air rising here. All right, so up and down. And what this is ultimately doing is this is kind of the setup region for the flow that comes off Asia and the westerlies and determines where that Pacific jet is going to be. Now, that's only one part of the story, right? I mean, once this gets across North America, we get influences from the Atlantic. And going later into the season, these Atlantic influences are going to become a bigger part of this story. But as we play this forward, I continue to see this. The models just continue to show us that there's this long stripe straight up and down on the graph showing me that there's going to continue to be right over this area of phase 3, 4, 5, and 6 sinking motion. So what do we get over Africa? See the blue-green from now all the way to the end of the month, we get rising motion. It's here as well, and it's even over here as well. So this is the most dominant factor. And again, I made a case that this was primarily being controlled by the Indian Ocean dipole, right? And so we look at this and say, well, what are we seeing here over the next, couple of weeks? And what we're seeing overall is that there's going to be, more rising motion here and sinking motion there. And so this carries us all the way out there almost to the end of October, and we're seeing this very, just very common look to the pattern suggesting that the Indian Ocean dipole, which we've been explaining, is going to influence things. There's been one shift, though, and it's been in the latest forecast here by the phase position of the North Pacific jet. It's going to be moving away from its poleward shift, staying extended, but giving us a bit more of a southerly track to it. And I want to show you what that means. You see, we can look at this a couple different ways. The first part of that transition is going to go away from these very big, high positive events in the Pacific. And what I mean by that is we're looking at the Pacific North American pattern. And as we learned, anytime you see these kind of bumps or ridges in the time series, which goes out 2 weeks, this indicates a ridge in the west and a ridge in the west. Now that takes you all the way out there to next weekend. And when we have large ridges in the west, we tend to get troughs in the east. And those troughs are settling into the southeast and keeping things pretty cool and unseasonably cool, actually. But as you note, there's 2 big ridge events coming. And then by the time we get into midweek next week, we're looking at a pretty sizable change in the Pacific Northwest. And that trough would indicate cold air coming down the west coast. And that's going to bump up a ridge in the southeast. And this is exactly what I'd expect to have happen if the MJO is really in the phases I just showed you. Now let's go have a look at it here. This is what the jet stream looks like today. There's the deep trough that's exiting east. There's the ridge over the west. And here's our extended Pacific jet that's about to get all bunched up as we work our way through this week. So by Wednesday into Thursday, we're going to watch a system roll right over the top of the Pacific Northwest. On Tuesday, this is really going to stir up a system here in parts of Alberta and Saskatchewan, bringing in some really strong winds to Montana. But overall, there's still a lot of cold air in this trough that's over the east while the warmth stays in the west. But the action is going to happen right here. Now watch this. This is Thursday. Going into Friday and Saturday, the Pacific jet makes a hard turn up toward like the Chukchi Sea. And then it becomes very meridional. See this diving down south? And then we pull out a trough to the south of it. So what are we building here? This is a high coming in like this over a low coming in like that. And that's going to bunch up the pattern. And that's going to allow what we've seen repeatedly happening in the east to kind of fade away. Now watch. This is next Saturday. The models did this all weekend. So this was in the forecast, quite consistent. And by day 10, we have now taken that blocked flow over the west. Here's our jet. It breaks apart. There's the northern part, the southern part, high over low and through here, trough west, ridge southeast. And that's going to really invigorate things across the midsection of the country, again, midweek next week. So what does all this mean? Well, let's get in here and take a look at the height pattern. Let's show this real quick. There's our trough now. There's the pesky Canadian ridge that's finally going to get on the way out. So we have, by the middle of this week, another reinforcing trough that dives in, brings in some unsettled weather with it, but sits over the southeast, another round of cold air. Now playing this forward into the weekend, look, high over low helps downstream trough develop. So watch this right here. Ready? It's kind of just barely in shades of blue. Now the models really drop a deep trough into the west as the wave breaks over the top. So there's a whole lot more meridional flow in this than what we've seen, which was more zonal flow in the last 10 days. So this allows a southeast ridge to build, a west coast trough to develop, and that is exactly what I expect when we get in MJO Phase 8. That pattern is preferred in MJO Phase 8. Okay, so end result of all of it, there's your next 7 days compared to average. We're drier across most of the country. Yeah, there's a system rolling through here. I'll show it to you in a second, but it's not completely saturated with moisture. So this is a 7-day sliding window of average precipitation anomalies. And here we are now looking at day 4 through 10. And did you see the dryness get peeled back toward the southeast? Well, now this picks up on Thursday, October 26th. That's the last day, and the 7 days before that. So this is this Thursday to next Thursday. And watch what we see as we go from Friday to Friday and Saturday to Saturday. So this is all of next week. With the trough in the west, we're going to open up the Gulf because of a ridge in this area. So the flow comes around it, and that starts to set off a system. It's actually going to be fed on some moisture coming out of the East Pacific as well. And I'm going to show you that again in a few moments. So we do have this pattern that is evolving, still week on, week off, as we've been talking about now. So a drier week ahead, cooler east, and then it's going to break. It's going to go over wetter again with a big transition. Now the west going cool and the east going warm. Now, I mentioned something about the tropics, and there's 2 areas we're keeping an eye on. There is a tropical disturbance down here that's got a really high probability of developing and then getting pulled into this pattern about 10 days from now. So again, cutting across Mexico. We got to watch this one very carefully. We then have the system we talked about last week coming across the Atlantic. But at this point, the best evidence for this system that's got a 70% chance of developing is to likely get pulled around the subtropical high that might be in this area just to take it back out to open ocean. I don't have a lot of evidence that this is going to be coming into the U.S. So we've got about 15 more days on our tropical season, and we're still watching a lot of activity. So Sean is still sitting here, and we're going to keep an eye on this one curling into Mexico. Now, I'm going to go back to the long range here, and I'm going to show you what the CPC released on Friday. Now, remember, when they build this on Friday, they have evidence on Friday, right? I watched the whole weekend change in the forecast. They'll update theirs next Friday. But what you're seeing here is a bit, I don't know, I look at it, and I'm trying to make sense of what I'm seeing here, because I think we're going to see more often than not, getting into the end of October and beginning of November, more frequent visits of troughs here. And I think that's going to open up an area to wetter conditions in the Midwest and in the Mid-South and throughout the Great Plains. which means if the pattern I just drew for you makes a bit more sense, then I agree with their precipitation outlook, but I don't agree with the temperature outlook. In other words, this cold that's going to stay in New England, I don't think we're going to see as much cold weather to finish the month as advertised and to start November. I think what they were going after was kind of some persistence in the pattern doing something like this, but I was a bit confused on how that got the southern part of the Mississippi Basin or the southeast or the south as wet as it did. So it's just, their forecasts are amazing. I love what the National Weather Service does, but I wonder what they would revise after seeing some of the weekend model runs. I really do, because this is what the European model trended toward. Now, this is a much longer outlook. Their previous outlook went to November 10th. I'm going to show you from October 25th to November 25th. And as we look over that time frame, we're seeing a larger area in through here looking at wetter conditions. The west is looking at wetter. So this tells me to expect a much more active polar jet reinforced by a subtropical jet. And as a result, we see more of the country showing up with wetter conditions. We also see this. If we look at the temperature pattern over that same time period, we're favoring warmer days in this area, primarily due to the deeper troughs that are coming into the west. Now, I can make sense of all of that given that the MJO right now is running straight up and down on the diagram and therefore staying in phase 8. And if it stays there, or phase 8, phase 1, doesn't matter. We just tend to see, more often than not a trough. It doesn't mean a trough every day. No, of course it doesn't mean that. It just means that they're going to return. So I think right now I buy into what this European model outlook is suggesting for late October through late November. I think it's going to be active overall. Now, let's just talk about some support for this. I think the support for it is coming from the Indian Ocean. Now, we talked about this a lot lately. Strong trade winds give us rising motion here, comes back across the top of the Indian Ocean and sinks. So that's not arrows going north-south, that's going up-down. This is going across the ocean. That's what's keeping suppression in the flow here. It's being helped by El Nino, which continues to develop as an east-based El Nino. But I think what's reinforcing the troughiness here is that there's cold water here, part of the negative PDO, and I think that's going to help just keep systems diving into the southwest. The negative PMM, which is here, is going to help reinvigorate the subtropical jet. I think once we get into November, those two things are going to send the jet, maybe that's a bit too dramatic, it's going to send the jet doing like this a lot. And that flow from the southwest across the country is just one that sets things up a whole lot more than otherwise. I don't think El Nino is doing anything but maybe helping the MJO stay over here because of the IOD. Sorry for all the acronyms, but the Indian Ocean dipole is controlling where the subsidence is. And El Nino is just kind of sitting back saying, all right, go ahead. I'll wait till later to engage. Because if you said, well, what would El Nino typically do to November? Sorry, this is what it typically does. So I pulled off all those El Nino years since 1960. They were drier through the Midwest, drier in the Pacific Northwest, wet in California, and wet in the Southeast. And you say, well, why? Well, in those years, the jet came over the top, and the subtropical jet extended to the south, and it did that. So we keep all of these areas wet where the flow comes in from the southwest, all of the areas dry where it comes in from the northwest. That's what El Nino would do, and yet we don't see it doing that. There's not a lot of model indication that that's going to happen. And certainly you've known that all year long, the El Nino forecast has been one where it's been a background player, not a dominant player. So from there, what's the bigger shift? Well, I've shown you this multiple times, but I still don't necessarily agree, though, with the longer range European prediction of a dry West Coast November, December, January. This makes sense to me, but not this. And I'll just make the statement again. I think that the newest update from the National Multi-Model Ensemble, which was the only model to get the dryness in the upper Midwest right back in May, it's picked up more on the summer patterns pretty well. I think that it's got it right for November, December, January. Now, we are yet to see those big, northern latitude things show up. And I want to make something very clear here. When you hear a lot of people chattering about the North Atlantic Oscillation, the Arctic Oscillation, the polar vortex, those kind of things, and they'll make claims that this is what they're expecting all winter, those are all sub-seasonal factors. So they fluctuate on the timescale of 1 to 2 to 3 weeks. So there's no use in trying to predict them out this far and saying you know exactly where they're going to be all winter. What I'm saying is the only long-range seasonal factors to be discussing are the Indian Ocean dipole, the warm North Atlantic, El Nino, the fact that we have a negative PDO, and we have negative PMM. Okay, those are the big long-term factors that help control the pattern. So I've been talking over a map that stitches together what those things typically do, and that's why I buy into this right now. Those subseasonal factors, oh yeah, we'll talk about them, just like the P&A at the beginning of this conversation, okay? All right, sorry about all that, but that's just something I want to make a point about. What are we dealing with early this morning at 5:45? We still have the high wind advisories out for Montana. That's coming on Tuesday. We have a pretty high chance at seeing winds over 55 miles an hour. There's a better than 50% chance across this whole area of getting winds over 55 miles an hour. This is this morning's frost freeze risk, and that's about all we've got across the country as we kind of look forward here. One thing I want to point out, we're going to look at both models, but we watched over the weekend the GFS skill scores plummet while the European model has stayed pretty high overall. So keep that in mind as I show you both the models compared. Sorry, I was looking ahead. Let's go back to this. Let's blow that up one time. There we go. So GFS left, European right. We have pesky kind of clouds and showers still sitting in over here in parts of the east. This is all associated with the storm system that kind of rolled through this past week. Now, if I take you back, there is a boundary, a front that's coming through later today that's going to hit from Northern California up to like Seattle. And that's going to kick a system off that's going to go right over the top into parts of, Alberta into Saskatchewan. And as that system sits here and spins, it's going to bring in some very strong winds on Tuesday into Montana. Now, watch this system here. It's going to come over the top and it's going to dive into the Midwest later this week. So finally, the GFS picked up on that. Do you remember last week the GFS was super wet down here? Well, now you see that it doesn't have that moisture in this area. So we're going to watch the European model because it's been more accurate on the solution. That low then goes over the Great Lakes, and both models now agree that it's going to deliver some precipitation right here through parts of the Ohio River Valley, getting over to the west side of the Appalachian Mountains, and then down into the southeast. That's by Friday. That's the only system I really have to tell you about. Comes in the northwest, brings really windy conditions into Montana, delivers some light rain into parts of the Red River Valley and surrounding states, dives over the Corn Belt into the eastern Great Lakes, and by the end of the weekend should have some reinforcement with the deeper trough here, meaning we're going to watch a bigger system this weekend go into parts of New England. That's it. That's your week. Now, after that, watch tropical system. See it here? And then watch the next deep low come into the west. Now, as this all takes shape next Monday into Tuesday, multiple low-pressure systems roll into the northwest. The moisture from this tropical system gets yanked across Mexico into Texas, and this is why week 2 we're going to be watching for a big system in the midsection of the country, possibly a snowmaker on the back side of it, much colder air diving into the west, and, as you can see here, lows curling up along the west coast. Sorry, that's a little bit jumpy this morning, but right there. That's the pattern change that we're expecting to see. So I went ahead this morning and added up all the rain through the next week, and I'll just do it for you again. Look at this. There's the frontal system coming in. It goes over the top up into Alberta, Saskatchewan, delivers a little bit of light rain to Montana, then the northern plains, then throughout the Midwest and Great Lakes, and spins up into a larger system this weekend east. Okay, that's through Sunday. What you're going to watch after that is the moisture getting pulled from this tropical system, deep lows coming into the west, and at the very end of the run, watch. We just start to fill in the middle again. That's week on, week off. Probability-wise, I want to show you the chances of that system next week showing up. So what I'm playing through here is an animation that's both color-coded and labeled with respect to the position that the models are putting low pressure. 101 simulations here. This is this weekend's deep low over the east. See it there? Now what we're going to watch for is the next system to really show up next Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. There it is. Now look at the setup. This whole area, see all the lows in there? That's where the models are currently dropping a pressure trough. They're going to feed it with a ridge over the southeast and over the mid-Atlantic, pumping in the moisture. And that's why week 2 is looking very active in the central part of the United States. Until then, though, we're drier. That's your chance of getting over an inch over the next 10 days. So remember, it's day 10 that things get active here. So the flow goes over the top of this and dives in. It's wettest here. Got the little system that rolls through midweek here. But other than that, we're drier across a big section of the country. All right, what about week 2, though? This is what we're talking about. In fact, the European model, that really showcases what I think week 2 is going to look like with the reinvigoration of the system. So we're back on to week off now, week on next week in the midsection of the country. Temperature-wise, risk of a frost over the next 7 days is shown here. But we're going to see some major cold air coming into the west. But again, not until the P&A crashes. So let's walk through the daily high temperatures just to see what to expect this week. Still cold east, very warm west, strong downslope winds here, what's promoting some of the warmer conditions in Montana, 103 in Phoenix, 101 in Southern California. But as we move forward Tuesday, big warm up in the midsection of the country. This is by Wednesday. We pop back up above average in the midsection while the southeast stays cool. The west still under its next big ridge here. Very, very warm temperatures, 20 degrees above average in the west. Then we go into Friday and Saturday. Here's when the big low spins up east, so watch the cool down there. And there's the beginning of the change. Now the models really see it in the ensemble forecast. So there's your next 5 days, no surprises. There's day 5 through 10. Do you see that right at the very end of the time period? The warmth shifts to the middle part of the country, the cool enters the west, and then to finish the month of October, this is what we get. That is phase 8. Look at that trough coming in, ridge developing here, action in the midsection of the country. That gets you all the way out to Halloween. So that's what we're currently looking at in terms of the pattern. Now, we've already looked at the longer range, so we're just going to stop there with the short term and switch our attention to some international weather. I want to show you this. I'm actually going to build my own version of this, and I'll put it up on my website so you've got it. But this is using satellite-derived data from the GPM mission, which is the Global Precipitation Mission. And this is what we call a product called iMerge. Now, what you're looking at here is over the last 7 days where the precipitation has been. So in South America, there's all the flooding we expected down in southern Brazil. And there's the wetter conditions in through central and getting up into this part of kind of north central Brazil, and the very dry conditions we continue to forecast for Bahia. So you can see that the European model I continue to show you has verified, right? Dry Argentina, dry here, wet in between. Now, because of this, we looked at the latest data last Friday, came out late in the day on Friday, that in Mato Grosso, biggest producing state in Brazil, is right now at 35% planted. Last year they were at last year they were at 41%, so they're behind last year's pace by 6%, but they're ahead of the 5-year average by 7%. So will we see a slowdown in this in the next week? I think we will, because as we talked about last week, we're going to watch some heat build into this area, and we're also going to watch the precipitation begin to back off. So, whoops, sorry about that. If we take a look, there we go, at this next 10-day time period, much of Brazil's growing area is going to see drier than normal conditions, which means they're going to slow down planting because it's not a good enough moisture to put the seed in. It won't germinate. There's probably going to be some replant out of this as well. So I don't expect the record planting pace, to jump back up to that anytime soon. Still very wet in southern Brazil, but we did watch the models increase the precipitation here in throughout Argentina, which is absolutely critical to that particular area. But again, I want to show you the temperature pattern, just let you know that we're quite cool throughout the Scandinavian countries. But take a look at this. Very warm in Siberia. This is very important for snowpack this time of year here. Australia is enduring another heat wave, and it's very, very dry. And again, 5 to 10 degrees C above average in parts of South America. And where that's being seen in the global precipitation pattern, and this is my last map for today, quite wet and stormy across Europe, getting all the way over to Ukraine and the Russian wheat belt. We see wet conditions throughout parts of Southeast Asia, but the subsidence is here. That's affecting Australia's drier conditions. And again, we've talked about South America, but look at these tropical systems, one here and one there we're going to have to keep an eye on. So a lot of neat stuff going on internationally to kind of watch here. All right, appreciate you letting me start your week. We'll give you another forecast tomorrow morning. Until then, have a good one. Thank you.